Alexandria, Egypt, Movietone News brings you the latest incident to upset the chancelleries of the free world. President Nasser delivering his fiery speech telling of his nationalization of the Suez Canal. A seizure from private interests that the Egyptian says is his answer to the West for refusing to finance the Aswan Dam. It's a situation fraught with implications. But undeterred, President Nasser raises his country's flag to symbolize his action. And although his followers hail him and carry him triumphantly on their shoulders, in London, Paris, and Washington, the fate of the strategic waterway causes grave concern. A lifeline between the East and West, the free world does not want it dependent on the Egyptian government, which sends U.S. Undersecretary of State Murphy to London. Arriving in the Egyptian capital from Alexandria, where he proclaimed his seizure of the Suez Canal Company, President Nasser finds Cairo's population in a veritable nationalistic frenzy. An acclaiming multitude which escorts him like a hero to the presidential palace, where he delivers another fiery speech in answer to opposition to his provocative action. Action which brings U.S. Secretary of State Dulles flying to London, where the English wait in the rain to see another momentous conference get underway at 10 Downing Street. It's a three-power meeting with France the third party, and the talks tend to favor international rule for the canal, with a bid to Russia to take a part. In Cairo, President Nasser's top aide, Wing Commander Ali Sabri, explains Egypt's challenge to the West by its seizure of the Suez Canal, but pays no heed to protests as his country drafts plans for a general mobilization. A threatening gesture that sees French, British, and U.S. forces in the Mediterranean spring to activity, as here at Toulon, the great French naval base, where a fleet has gotten ready to steam Suezward. While in England, naval reservists converge on Plymouth to man 3 aircraft carriers that Britain is dispatching to the troubled waterway. A precautionary measure in the event of Egypt's refusal to attend the 24-nation meeting called to internationalize the seized canal. Regiments of paratroopers, too, are on the move, as here at Portsmouth. For each of the 3 British flat tops sailing to the Mediterranean will be loaded with these most modern of fighting units, as the West, challenged again, faces the facts.
The Suez Canal, storm center of controversy for weeks, now becomes a cause of war in a lightning sequence of diplomatic and military moves. Since its seizure and nationalization by President Nasser of Egypt, the vital waterway has precipitated a new crisis in the already tense Middle East. Crack French units are embarked at Marseille, bound for a joint staging area with Great Britain on Cyprus, less than an hour's flight from Egyptian ports, where they are prepared for seizure of the canal by force. Simultaneously, Britain reinforces its garrison on the island for the same eventuality. A naval concentration in the eastern Mediterranean strengthens the military buildup, even as Israel, in a lightning attack, thrusts deep into Egypt to the vicinity of the canal. France and Britain issue a 12-hour ultimatum that all fighting must cease. Within hours of its expiration, Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo.
Arriving from the west to avoid frontal attacks on densely populated areas, Israeli forces from the Sinai Desert occupy the troubled Gaza Strip, taking early precautions that keep to a minimum incidents that could provoke bloodshed. A peaceful occupation that allows the native populace maximum freedom. Later, after a flight on a reconnaissance plane over the Sinai Peninsula, Movietone News visits with the Israeli troops, which defeated the Egyptians in this desert no man's land. Considered an act of self-preservation, the expedition results in the fall of the Egyptian fortress at Sharm el-Sheikh, which was firing on shipping bound for Israel. It yields thousands of prisoners to the victorious forces, with $40 million worth of battle equipment which Cairo recently received from Soviet Russia. Raising cheers for General Moshe Dayan, Israeli Commander-in-Chief.
Following a Security Council veto by Britain and France of a United States motion for a ceasefire, President Eisenhower, after consultation with Secretary of State Dulles, makes a firm declaration of United States policy.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. In the circumstances I have described, there will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. I therefore have no plan to call the Congress in special session. Of course, we shall continue to keep in contact with congressional leaders of both parties. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, with no veto operating, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem. In the past, the United Nations has proved able to find a way to end bloodshed. We believe it can and that it will do so again.
The whole question is brought before an emergency session of the General Assembly, where it faces the bar of world opinion.
The amphibious landing of French commandos at Port Fouad, east of the Suez Canal, proceeds as a jet bombing just about paralyzes the Egyptian defenses. And scenes reminiscent of many Allied invasions during World War II are enacted in strength for the first time since the end of that conflict. Hardly any Egyptian resistance is met, and the French are soon in the city, rounding up the remnants of Colonel Nasser's army. But sunken ships dotting the canal make the value of the action questionable, doubly so now that it halts here. France with Britain agreeing to a ceasefire at the request of the United Nations. At Port Said, the major city on the west bank of the Suez, the British had a real tough time. They ran into heavy fire and had to fight desperately to achieve their objective and maintain the time schedule as agreed upon with their French allies. Evidence of the fury of the battle is everywhere throughout this great port, one of the world's most vital shipping centers. Colonel Nasser's agreement to allow a United Nations police force to patrol the Suez came too late to prevent this desolation. At Cappuccino Airport, Naples, the word of Nasser's agreement to the UN police force starts the first contingent Suezward. It's a unit from Denmark and will be transported to its Egyptian patrol post by U.S. Globemasters. Outside Port Said, members of the United Nations Ceasefire Observation Party prepare for a tour between the front lines of the opposing forces at the Suez Canal. 9 white-painted Jeep station wagons carry the observers, who make their inspection over the narrow canal causeway. Where separated only by 250 yards, the Anglo-French and Egyptian armies face each other. Sitting in Jerusalem, the Israeli parliament upholds Premier Ben-Gurion's decision to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. His country's objectives attained, the premier by his action obeys the UN and proves Israel is not seeking to expand territorially. But $40 million worth of captured equipment, most of it recently supplied by Russia, proves to Israel's satisfaction that Colonel Nasser, spurred by the Kremlin, was considering aggressive action from the Sinai Peninsula. What other reason, the Israeli ask, could Cairo have for maintaining this vast war potential in a desert, except to provide its suicidal Fatayeens with the wherewithal for their raids? A vast prize to a lightning strike that upsets the communist timetable. As shortages follow the disruption caused by the Anglo-French action around the Suez Canal, the city of Port Said has to resort to bread rationing. The British, after taking the city following a 2-day struggle, are pulling out, an action complying with the United Nations Assembly's decision. The Tommies are being returned to Cyprus, from where the assault on the Suez was launched. All of which brings Canada's General Burns, who will command the United Nations Suez Police, on an inspection tour of the area to be patrolled. Starting from Abu Suwair on the west of the canal near Ismailia. A force for peace. The first unit to land behind the Egyptian lines is brought in by Swiss airplanes chartered by the United Nations. The harbor of Port Said, which is the canal's major seaport on the west bank, is revealed as a graveyard of sunken ships. A gesture by the Egyptians to thwart the main objective of the Anglo-French invasion, which was to keep the vital waterway open. But with the fighting all over, the canal is blocked and may continue so for months. Meanwhile, throughout Western Europe, as here in Paris, the shortage of gas caused by the sabotaging of the Suez recalls the fuel famines of World War II. A situation that will continue until the United Nations patrol makes possible the removal of the sunken ships that now block the international waterway. Today, the shortage in France is so acute, the government issued orders that the petrol on hand be reserved for doctors and nurses, etc., etc. Parading through Port Said, the United Nations police force for the Suez Canal is given a rousing welcome by the citizens of the West Bank city. It's a spontaneous demonstration, but British troops are forced to clear the way for the peace patrol when communist agitators in the crowd try to provoke the Egyptians into an unfriendly attitude. But the people refuse to be deluded and recognize the force for what it is. And the United Nations patrol for peace at the vital waterway becomes an historic fact. The patrol action of the United Nations will mean the quick release of these thousands of Egyptian prisoners held somewhere in Israel. They were captured by Israeli forces in the battles of the Sinai Desert. When deserted by their officers, they surrendered with $40 million worth of arms supplied by Russia and Czechoslovakia. From Port Said at the Suez Canal, your Movietone News camera catches a British man-of-war proceeding through the waterway. The first ship of any kind to move over the canal since the crisis precipitated by the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt. Another achievement of the United Nations emergency force headed by Canada's General Burns, shown here at Port Said with General Cately, commander of the British forces in the area. General Burns is in Egypt to set up headquarters at the ceasefire line between the Anglo-French and Egyptian forces, an action that coincides with the departure of British troops from the city on the Suez. A praiseworthy British gesture in deference to the United Nations and in the cause of peace. For the British lost many Tommies to the fierce Egyptian opposition they encountered taking the port.